I'm going to begin now if we're ready. Welcome, everyone. I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of DevX. I want to welcome the many hundreds of people, well over 1,000, I believe, who have registered for this event, who are joining us from all over the world as we bring you a really special and important event on a special day. Today is International Youth Day. I want to welcome all of you to an important moment on a day like this, when we talk about an issue that often doesn't get the attention it deserves, but it will today. And I think you're going to be treated to an incredible array of speakers and insights from people who are leading on one of the most important issues in the world, which is how do we provide education to children during emergencies and during protracted crises. We at DevX are really proud to be bringing this to you today in partnership with Education Cannot Wait, an organization that if you haven't heard of it, you will learn a lot about them today. You will hear from their leaders in just a moment, and you'll get some great and very valuable statistics about what exactly is this issue that we're describing. I think maybe the best way to think of it is in the name itself. Education cannot wait. We really historically as a world, as a global community, have said the exact opposite. We have said that when there's a crisis, when there's an emergency, when children are forced to flee their homes, that we should provide food and shelter and medical attention, but that education can wait. And that has borne itself out in the way our budgets reflect our own priorities. A very small percentage, in the low single digits, of humanitarian aid has gone historically to providing education to children who are in emergencies. And of course, there are now more crises and more protracted crises than ever before. And the world is on an upswing in this way. And unfortunately, many children, actually 75 million children, find themselves in this situation. And the world has started to take notice of this. Back in 2016 at the World Humanitarian Summit, one of the key outcomes was the creation of Education Cannot Wait, a global fund and a coalition, a movement really to push the world to prioritize this issue. And there has been some real success around it. We'll talk about that just shortly now. But the issue has not gone away. And in fact, during this pandemic, it is likely to get much worse. It's something maybe all of us who have children, all of us who are living at home and have other kids around, who have seen what disruptions in the education system can mean in our own households and our own communities, all of us might have a more visceral connection to today. But just think that if there were a country of 75 million children, that's the scale of the problem today that so many are facing. You're going to hear from people who have faced this directly in our session today. So before I bring you some really remarkable speakers and we dig even deeper into this issue, we want to just lay down the foundation and give you some of the data points and statistics to better understand these issues. And as you're following along, we do want to hear from you. Please add your questions. Please tweet. You can tweet at Stronger Together in Crisis or use the hashtag DevXEvents. And we're really looking forward to welcoming all of you who are part of this discussion to what is a really critical issue at an important moment on International Youth Day. So thank you for being a part of it. And I'll ask the producers to just cue the video now if they can. Well, I hope that video gave you a sense of the scale of the challenge, but also of the scale of the opportunity. There is so much progress that has been made and more that can be made now. And I want to bring someone to help lay the groundwork for today's session, someone who knows something about crisis. Gordon Brown, the Right Honorable Gordon Brown, was, of course, the Prime Minister of the UK during the financial crisis, and he led his country through that. And he left politics, he left government, and has dedicated his career now to the issue of global education. He has a number of roles. Of course, he's the UN Special Envoy for Global Education, and he chairs the high-level steering group of Education Cannot Wait. And Gordon, I would love to hear your take, if you can, sir, on this issue, particularly in this moment of crisis. We've heard so much about the pandemic and how it's affected so many issues. But what has it meant for children who find themselves in an emergency, in a crisis situation? Please get us started today.
Well, thank you. 2 years ago, when I introduced the ECW annual report, Education Cannot Wait's annual report, I highlighted the Moria refugee camp in Greece, where during a summer, devoid of support, devoid of nutrition, devoid of education, 3 teenagers, so desolate, were found to have attempted suicide. And I said then that hope dies, not just when a refugee ship is lost at sea or when a convoy can't get through to a depressed and besieged town, but hope dies when young people cannot plan and prepare for the future because there is no school to go to, there is no education that is within their grasp. Now, 2 years on, thanks to the work of Yasmin Sharif and Education Cannot Wait, thanks to the coordination they achieved, thanks to what's been done in so many different countries, Afghanistan, Uganda, Yemen, Bangladesh, around the world, thanks to all that, we have done a huge amount. But we now are doubly hit. We are doubly hit. We have the lost generation of displaced children, 30 million refugees, 40 million displaced, 75 million in conflict in emergency zones, and we now have the COVID generation deprived of school. And some people think 30 million children will never return to school, even although they had been there before the epidemic. And it is incumbent upon us now to send out a message of hope. Hope that is based on faith that education can bridge the gap between what people are and what they have it in themselves to become. Belief that we can, by getting every child who is in a conflict zone, an emergency zone, into school, we can indeed be the first generation where every single child is given the chance of schooling. And also confidence that we can raise this 310 million so that Education Cannot Wait can be effective, and we can build back better so that after this virus, education is in a stronger position to help young people. And I hope what is done today during the different interventions is to show the concrete measures we can now take to get children back to school, to help them to catch up, and of course, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal, which cannot be achieved unless Education Cannot Wait can be effective and get displaced children into school. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Gordon Brown has given us clear marching orders. Thank you for doing that as we get started in our session today. And you brought up some stark figures. You talked about 30 million young people that have been in school that may never be again. And you're going to hear some of these big numbers. But one of the things we also want to do today is bring you, as Gordon Brown has, some of these specific stories. And so I'd like to welcome to the conversation someone who has a remarkable story of courage and of hope and has become quite a leader on these issues. I'd like to bring Nujeen Mustafa, who is a UNHCR high-profile supporter, into the discussion, along with Dag Ulstein, who is Norway's Minister of International Development. And we're going to have a kind of a rapid-fire conversation, really getting into a lot of the issues that Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, just brought up. Nujeen, maybe I can begin with you. You have this remarkable personal story. You grew up in Aleppo in Syria. You had to flee your own country, and you had to flee in a wheelchair. And you made it all the way. It's a remarkable story that people can read about in your own writing, with your sister, to Germany, where you now live. What did that experience teach you? Now that you're a leader on these issues, what did it teach you about why education cannot wait, about why we should prioritize these issues when there's so many other issues in the world to prioritize?
Well, thank you, Raj, for having me today. Perhaps I should start at the beginning. So growing up in Syria, even before the war, was not easy. As a disabled person, I did not have access to education because infrastructure was not built to accommodate a person with a disability. So you would have government buildings that were not accessible. So I had to educate myself at home using television, books, and the assistance of my older siblings. And of course, as the conflict started, the situation deteriorated even further. I was forgotten at a time of peace. And it has become even worse at a time of war. So I found myself at a place where I had to flee because my safety was jeopardized. So we just decided to flee the country and go on this journey from Syria to Germany in a wheelchair. Of course,
And I understand you couldn't afford to go as a whole family. You only were able to go with your sister.
Yes, and of course I tried to do the best with what I had with the resources that I had, but not being able to go to school is a fate that I wouldn't wish on any child in this world. So this this number of 75 million children who are not able to access school is something that is a failure on our part, on the part of everybody in this room, and it is something that is unacceptable and inexcusable.
Yeah, I think that may very well be true, and we probably all agree with that who are part of this session today. But I want to ask Minister Ulstein exactly about that point, because it is shocking when you hear these figures, and yet there's only a few percent of the humanitarian aid budget that goes to education for these children. And we still, although we've made some real progress in the last few years, particularly since Education Cannot Wait was created, there's still such a long way to go. How do you think about this, Minister, when you think about Norway's tremendous commitments to foreign assistance? How do you think about prioritizing this issue?
Yes, thank you so much. And first of all, Najeen, thank you for sharing. And I just want to say, first of all, your story has really inspired a lot of people all around the world. And for us to hear a bit of it again today, it's so important. So thank you so much, Najeen. And as you said, we're in the midst of a crisis that we never thought would come, that only make it more difficult for many of the most marginalized ones, and also especially in areas with conflict and that are in huge crisis already. So that means that we need to prioritize and again, the most marginalized ones and refugees and IDPs need to have focus, and then we know that education for these groups is so crucial. So again, and as Honorable Gordon Brown also talked about, there are so many stories about children and about girls and about children with disabilities that we really need to unlock the resources that could give them the right potential and actually show them the importance and how they can engage in their society. So this is so important and very important for the Norwegian government to take our seats and to stand up and step up in this important effort.
Yeah, this feels like a moment when the world is facing a truly global crisis. Of course, countries like Syria, where Najeen is from, many parts of the world have been facing crisis for many years, but now we're all in this in a way where we can experience it more personally. And hopefully that provides an opportunity to think bigger and to do something more bold on an issue like this. Najeen, maybe you can share your thoughts, because I imagine some people still think about crisis, and even our language may not have evolved enough. We think about crisis as something that comes and it goes. And really, for so many people, including for a place like Syria, crisis has been with us for many, many years. And we use this language of protracted crises. Maybe you could just shed a little light on how you think about that and how we should all think about that.
I think that when it comes to crisis, it is something that has its consequences. It's not going to just go away and leave nothing behind it. So, for example, for a group like people with disabilities, which I represent, It's we have they have been at a disadvantage their whole life, and now their knowledge and experience is not being used effectively. So they are still underestimated. They are still like at a disadvantage when a crisis occurs in any part of the world, and they are still deprived of their education, as was the case with me. But I just feel like the thing is that these people and the people who come, these youngsters or these young people who come from a land of conflict, they are not a burden to be carried. They're not a problem that needs solving. They are a treasure that needs to be valued, and they are a resource that could be used for the betterment of any country that might host them. And when we ask for the rights of these people, we are not asking for a favor or a charity. This is their right as human beings.
I appreciate you underlining that point, because sometimes the frame that we bring to an issue like this is all wrong. And if we frame it the right way, we can change our own attitudes. So much of this, Minister Ollestein, is about framing these issues for Western audiences, for donor countries, to get more funding, to increase the priority of these issues. How do you think about this when you talk to average voters, to average citizens in your country and elsewhere, about how these issues that might seem very far away in the world actually do connect to them?
Yeah, it's from my point of view, I think it's really important that we build this bridge and connect the issues that we are having back home when it comes to equality and the rights. Because when it comes to education for people with disabilities, and as Nujeen is talking about, this is and your story, Nujeen, shows us that no one should be left behind. It shows us that your personal story, that talents and resources can be unlocked by supporting children and young people, and this is not kind of special needs for special groups. This is the same rights and the same needs that everyone else have in all countries. So I think to try to build that bridge and to engage young people and every generation in this is not always easy, but it's when we hear the stories like we got from Nujeen today, and to share those stories, that could make a difference. And even though there are difficult discussions when it comes to priorities in national budgets and also funding international development, also I think we have a strong support here in Norway when it comes to this area, and especially when it comes to education and education for vulnerable groups.
So the time is racing by, and we need to move to other speakers. I just want to ask you, Nujeen, for one final thought, for anyone who maybe finds themselves in the situation you're in now. Being displaced is becoming very common. We're talking about 75 million children who are in this situation. What would your message be to them at this point?
I would say don't lose hope. There's a light at the end of this dark tunnel.
Well, thank you, Nujeen. I know everyone at home watching this is applauding the two of you virtually. It's really important that we hear your story and your commitment. Thank you, Minister Dag Inge Ulstein and Nujeen Mustafa. Many thanks for being part of this today. And I now want to welcome our next speaker, who is a leader who works on these issues every day, Kelly Clements, who is with the United Nations. She's the Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees. Kelly, you've just heard the story from Nujeen, and you've heard the opening remarks that we've had today. We would love to get your take on the issues and the moment that we're facing.
Thanks very much, Raj, and I'm delighted to be with you and the rest of this esteemed program, but especially delighted to be with two treasures, Nujeen and Deborah, who have joined the program. Indeed, I love the expression, because they truly are. And I think what you've heard from Nujeen just now is that education is really a lifeline. for refugee children and youth. It gives them hope and opportunities. It gives them protection and safety, and it provides for the future. And not surprisingly, education is consistently noted as a high priority for refugee children and for their families, and we have a duty to provide it. Unfortunately, with increased displacement, and we gave you a lot of numbers earlier, so I won't give you more yet, but there are still barriers to accessing education, and we really are falling short. And to that end, I'd like to offer 3 points to frame this discussion that we're having this afternoon, bearing in mind in the context of COVID-19, which we all know has made it difficult for children around the world to access and to stay in school. First, there is a direct impact on learning. Refugee kids are not learning, which of course is the problem. The closure of schools have impacted more than 5.6 million primary and secondary age refugee children worldwide. Only half of those children are enrolled in school, but those school closures mean losing crucial time in terms of that learning and in the classroom. And approximately 2.8 million refugee children aged in the range of 5 to 17 already are out of school, but there's a risk that their needs will be forgotten, particularly with the crisis wrought by COVID-19. There have been some really good temporary solutions and adaptations to continue learning from home, radio programs, for example, television, and with technology, of course, digital learning becomes possible, but refugee kids sometimes cannot take advantage of these opportunities. Give you one example that connectivity is a challenge. For example, in the Kakuma camp in Kenya, there is not access to the FM radio where the educational materials are broadcast. Now, our teams are obviously trying to make do and send clips of screens through WhatsApp and the like, but they are still half as likely, refugees are, as the general population to have an internet-enabled phone, and 29% of refugees have no phone at all. So this is a barrier. With thanks to Education Cannot Wait's funding and other donors, we've been able to, in places like Ethiopia and Uganda, to do our utmost to reach students that are most in need, but we do need more support. Second issue, there are secondary risks associated with not being in school, which you all will know. For many refugee families, school is the essential source of stability and support. Entire programs are built around schools. For refugee adolescent girls, for example, Raj, children with disabilities, as we've just heard from Eugene, and other refugee children, they need specialized support, and distance learning opportunities do not always provide that support. School feeding programs become critically important in this and our tool to be able to mitigate some of these risks, that particularly when they're exacerbated by COVID-19. With hunger and malnutrition, we've seen some startling statistics from the World Food Program with regard to hunger that will increase by the end of this year. Schools are also essential to protect, and it's estimated that 31 million, mostly women and girls, will be subjected to gender-based violence by September, the end of September of 2020, if lockdowns continue. And forcibly displaced girls are among those most at risk. And we know that COVID-19 is exacerbating those risks, especially with regard to child marriage, for example, for adolescent girls, intimate and caregiver violence. And the third item, Raj, that I wanted to mention to frame are the long-term consequences. And this comes to livelihoods and solutions, both of which are at the core of the Global Compact on Refugees. Supporting displaced children to continue their education through secondary school is critical to their futures. Refugee girls especially need additional support. They are already half as likely to, as boys, to be enrolled in secondary education, as we know, and they must not be denied their right to education. And we know that that access to education makes it more likely to delay marriage, have healthier and fewer children, and become more economically active in their communities. And this has broad implications for livelihoods, and the massive socioeconomic pressures brought by COVID means that the gains that we've made, including importantly through education, we have a risk of losing them. We've teamed up, obviously, with the Malala Fund to suggest that once schools reopen, more than 50% of all refugee girls currently enrolled in secondary school may not re-enter school in some countries where enrollment is already low. It will have vast global repercussions, and we must address them. There is no substitute, Raj, for the long-term benefits of education or livelihoods. And for that reason, we are absolutely delighted to partner with Education Cannot Wait and other partners, and to both highlight why we need to address the challenges, know that we can make progress, and we can't lose the gains that we have achieved to date. So thank you so much for having us on the program and shedding the spotlight on such an important issue.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And thank you for really putting this in great context for us. You know, we tend to, in the international development and the humanitarian world, we tend to fall into our silos, our various silos. And I think what you eloquently demonstrated is that this is not a siloed issue. This connects to everything. And of course, if you talk to parents, you talk to families who are displaced, they will tell you this is a priority for them because they too know it connects to everything. So thank you for laying that out so clearly. We are moving along and learning so much already. I want to ask the speakers as we go to try to look at the clock because we are running a little bit tight on time, but I'm very excited for our next speaker, who is the leader of Education Cannot Wait, Yasmin Sharif. She's going to give us a flash talk and really highlight for us where this issue sits in context. She has helped to lead Education Cannot Wait to the successes you saw in that video, and has really started to build a global movement on this issue. Yasmin, please give us your thoughts today.
Sorry, I haven't unmuted. Now I have unmuted. So thank you, Kumar. Thank you, everyone who agreed to join us today. And thank you to everyone who is listening in. I just saw there's about 800 of you, or close to 800, 718. So that's great. And also for the very inspiring insights that have been shared. And especially Nogine, who spoke to us about the realities on the ground, but all our colleagues also in UNHCR, the Norwegian Minister Ulstein, and of course, the founder of Education Cannot Wait, Gordon Brown, who is also our chair of the high-level steering group. Now, bringing hope, which is so very important. And I would like to maybe go back to the title of the report that we launched yesterday and are launching in the context with this. The title, Stronger Together in Crisis. Yeah, I don't know if you can see it, but Stronger Together, I actually borrowed that from the ED4 of UNICEF, who came up with that in another discussion. This is brilliant because it's all about us being together. So you take the concept of Education Cannot Wait, which was conceived by Gordon Brown, civil society, the UN agencies at the World Humanitarian Summit, and then the concept of working together. And I think that explains one reason why we've been able to move so very fast. And you mentioned we have to break down the silos, and that's precisely what we are doing. Why is it important to look at it that way? First of all, you stop thinking about mobilizing resources for yourself. As a global fund for education in emergency and protracted crisis, we hardly see any of that money coming in because we are a very lean fund. The joy of this work is to bring the resources to those who are doing the actual work on the ground out there. All the great non-governmental organizations, all the great UN agencies, the governments we are working with, and the private sector, and not the least the children and the school administration and teachers themselves. So I think that is the number one. Remove this whole issue of trying to raise money for oneself or one's own siloed area and say we are bringing it to the sector, we're bringing it to the children and the youth out there. And that's what the fund does. The second reason I think that the Stronger Together report shows for such significant progress, though a lot still has to be done, is the emphasis on speed and to remove redundant bureaucracy. Because we removed redundant bureaucracy, Education Cannot Wait, which means all of us were able to move with a record speed in response to COVID-19. And just a few weeks after the World Health Organization had declared it a pandemic, was able to deliver to 27 countries and actually exhaust our entire emergency emergency funding that was available, and then attract more funding to continue in our second round. And another reason, and this is important, is that we are part of a multilateral system that has been so questioned over the years. But if we're going to be strong together, we have to be multilateralists. And we have to believe in the multilateral system that was created precisely for this. And the fact that Education Cannot Wait is within that multilateral system, and more precisely in UNICEF, that has been an excellent host to ECW, allowing us to push the envelope, is also another reason that the report shows for these results. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details because it came out in that short video, and I'm mindful of the time. But we do know that 3.6 million children, it's not only that they have been reached, but they actually delivered a whole of child approach and a quality education that takes a very holistic approach that entails the full spectrum of the needs of a child or a young person, from the mental health and psychosocial services to school feeding, where WFP plays an important role, to teacher training, because teacher plays a central role for a child or a young person as mentors and as inspirational leaders also to them as they during their formative years. Cash assistance that allows most of these families of the 75 million children are living in extreme poverty. If you don't have the money, you may not even be able to financially send your child to a school, even if the school itself is free of cost. And infrastructure, which is very important, and it's also about creating infrastructure that is conducive to children with disabilities, and also be able to physically be in a protective environment to learn, especially in countries where you have violence and conflict, and also to empower, of course, governments so that they can build their own coordination units and create that sustainability of the investments that are being made by colleagues. So in country, the report testified to how fast we move. And we are moving this fast again because we are stronger together and we are working together, and there is flexibility and there is less bureaucracy. And it's a focus on accountability towards those we serve. And that is, I think, so it's a mindset that is so very important. How we look, one cannot have all these beautiful results matrices and create the perfect bureaucratic design of a program if one does not have the will and the attitude to remove the barriers that stands between us and the children and the youth. Looking at the situation of Nordin, for instance, one has to have removed the barriers and move boldly and overcome one's own fear. So that's very important too. And I think the spirit of our collective Education Cannot Wait approach. We have seen also, besides the results you will see in the report, we have also seen, as you have mentioned, several of you already, results at the global level, progress, I would say. Progress in the sense that in 2015, the humanitarian funding allocated to education was at 2.6%. 2.6. That's how little we were willing to provide to investing in the new generation, in their minds and their souls. Well, that's shifted. In the 2019 report, we can now confirm that the figure is actually at 5.1% of humanitarian funding going into education. It's far away from the ideal. The minimum we want to achieve is 10%, but the ideal would be 50%. 50% development financing and 50% humanitarian financing, and then private sector, of course, is part of both of these envelopes. But we have seen a growth. One reason is, of course, that all humanitarian coordinators in the entire multilateral system are today expected and held accountable for making education a priority. So it's a systemic change that we have pushed for and got strong support. I would give credit to OCHA for that, among others, for making sure that education is a priority for humanitarian budgeting. Then we have also, of course, we've seen in terms of the resources mobilized so far to the trust fund, it's about $650 million, which is a fair amount of funding. but of course not sufficient. But 650 million have been mobilized over the past 3 years. In addition, we have also leveraged $150 million in country against Education Cannot Wait's multi-year programs, where partners in country, donor partners, contribute directly. So for instance, there is an education joint program in a country like Mali, and UNICEF or UNHCR are undertaking important work. Partners go and contribute directly to UNHCR, UNICEF, or NRC, or DRC, or other NGOs. And we see this as leveraged funding because it goes against the design of that program. And in that regard, the total amount is actually $800 million today. And as Gordon Brown mentioned, for us to be able to, at least during COVID-19 and indeed the immediate recovery, be able to move in a more sustainable way, we urgently need $310 million. But in order to reach 9 million children, we need 1.8 billion. Now, to conclude here, another development that we have seen is that the multilateral system up to the UN Secretary General actually now is speaking about education as a top priority. And last week, the Secretary General's policy note on education in connection with the COVID and post-COVID-19 response was issued, where the Secretary General declared that the future of education is here, and it has arrived. I think we are about to enter a new phase where education will be put at the forefront. A lot of the groundwork has been laid, and if we all work together, and we of course become stronger together, but then we also jointly can take this to the next level. It is a collective effort. It all started with an idea or a vision of Education Cannot Wait, and it was made possible because of a design or a concept that we are stronger together. And with the financial resources, everything is possible. The concept is there, the vision is there. All that we need now is the financing on a design and an approach and a vision that actually works. And with that, I say thank you to everyone. It's wonderful to be here. And thank you to all colleagues for being Education Cannot Wait. Thank you.
Thank you, Yashmina. Thank you for several things, for underlining this idea of stronger together. It is the theme that brings us here as a group, for underlining that there is real progress. There has been tremendous success in a short time. And also that the numbers that we're asking for, in so many ways, they may seem dramatic, $310 million as they ask. And in some ways, it's so small when you think of the scale of the problems today and the amount of resources being brought against this pandemic. There is an enormous opportunity to bring the urgency we all feel toward this pandemic and toward responding it to 75 million young people. So I want to bring someone else to the discussion who gets up every day and has to think about these issues about how to educate the millions of young people living in her country in Afghanistan. It's the Minister of Education of Afghanistan is with us today. We're very honored to have Ranjina Hamidi. Minister, we would love to hear your brief thoughts about this issue and how you think about it in your role as Minister of Education.
Good afternoon from Afghanistan to family and friends, and thank you, Yasmin Sharif, for your kind invitation to this event. Very good to meet you, Mr. Kumar. If my education had waited, I would not be the Minister of Education today in Afghanistan. The first female education minister since the post-Taliban era of Afghanistan. As a refugee girl myself, it was narrated to my family in Pakistan that education was not necessary for me. But my father luckily thought otherwise. He decided to immigrate further from our neighboring country, Pakistan, and took his family all the way to the US simply for the reason of providing education opportunity for his daughters. And I'm one of 5 daughters that he had. As Minister of Education in Afghanistan today, who has returned back to her mother's country, I don't know if I'm lucky or unlucky to have been appointed as Minister of Education in Afghanistan during the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately. Today, it is my duty and responsibility to work with our global partners to reach our over 3.7 million students in Afghanistan who are out of school, and 60% of these students are girls. Girls from insecure, underinvested, culturally sensitive, hard to reach, and poor communities account for these 60% of the total number of students out of school today. I look at the COVID emergency pandemic as an opportunity to push ourselves to think outside of the box, to be creative, and not limit ourselves to providing and or receiving education inside the structures of a school, the traditional model of schooling. As an Afghan woman today, and I was a girl once, if girls cannot attend school, or if girls cannot access traditional education in a school, then we need to take education to girls where they are. And it is in their homes, in their communities, in their villages. And I am proud to say, as a Minister of Education today, that I don't mind encouraging our society to allow the tree and the shade of the tree to serve as an education platform, if it means that our girls will have access to education. My colleague and special advisor at the Ministry of Education, Dr. Wahid Yar, has worked hard during the past couple of years on community-based education. And I think Afghanistan is leading in this concept. And we have successful results to show and prove that when we take education to the communities, girls do get an opportunity to become educated. Finally, I would like to thank our special donors who have earmarked their funding for Afghanistan. Canada, the United Kingdom, Sweden, and Switzerland for giving us this privilege of earmarked funding, which will allow us to plan better, to strategize better. And I encourage many other donors to consider earmarked funding as they support special education for girls across the world. And I want to conclude by believing in Confucius' philosophy that says that if we want to plan for 100 years, we need to invest in educating our children. And in my particular case of Afghanistan, I want to invest in educating the girls of my country, because as a woman, I believe that the future of Afghanistan and the future of the world lies in educating young girls today. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to becoming a strong and active partner in all the work that we do together. Thank you again.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you especially for highlighting the fact that this is a crisis we have to think differently. If it's the shade of a tree, it's the shade of a tree. We heard Kelly Clements talk about radio as an opportunity. We need to be thinking about how do we bring education to the young girls, especially who need it. And I know that's the spirit of Education Cannot Wait and the many implementing partners around the world, the NGOs and others that work on these issues. So thank you for bringing that to the conversation, Minister. And we're going to move now to a dynamic panel conversation. And I want to begin in that panel with one of the young leaders that we mentioned at the outset. And you're going to get to hear her personal story. But let me just ask those panelists to turn on their cameras. And I want to just mention who they are. We're going to hear from, of course, Henrietta Fore, who's the Executive Director of UNICEF, Kamal Khera, the Parliamentary Secretary to Canada's Minister of International Development, and Justin Van Vliet, the President of Their World. But I want to begin with Deborah Kalumbi, who is really an advocate, a leader for young people and refugees, a refugee herself. She received the Daffy Scholarship from UNHCR, which I think to date has helped more than 15,000 young people attend university, refugees attend university. Deborah, can you maybe just tell us briefly a little bit about your own personal story and how it connects to everything we've been talking about today?
Okay, thank you very much, Raj. And I must say I'm really excited to be a part of this meeting. And thank you very much for having me. Well, my story is no different. My family and I moved from the DRC to Zambia in fear of our lives, of course. It was due to the time when the war broke out between the Mai Mai and Nyamurenge as a result of ethnicity. And it was right at that time when I was around the age of 8. And when we moved from the Congo to the DRC, back in the Congo, I was already in my 2nd grade. But when we moved to Zambia, I had to go back to my 1st grade because they thought I wasn't qualified enough to continue. It was hard because I was introduced to a new environment, a new culture, new language, and already we were different and people branded us as different. And it was right around that time where I could say education meant a lot to me. It played a massive role because it helped me to understand the diversity that existed. And it also helped me to embrace and accept my new lifestyle.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. It's not easy to even go to a new school. Forget about leaving your home country, your culture, your language, and going through those circumstances. And obviously, as we can see from how you've done and the leadership role you've taken on now, how much education can pay off for society in general. I want to ask our other participants to join the discussion too. Henrietta Fore, your name has already come up. And of course, you need no introduction for this group, but Henrietta is, of course, the executive director at UNICEF, formerly the administrator at USAID. You've spent your career leading on these issues, and Education Cannot Wait has hosted it at UNICEF as the secretariat. Maybe you can just add your own thoughts to this conversation as it's evolved so far.
Thank you very much, Raj. And it's a very happy International Youth Day, and education cannot wait, and we are stronger together. So I'm just delighted to join everyone. So at UNICEF, we look at people like Nujeen and Deborah and Minister Hamidi, and we are so proud of them that we've created a focus on 5 areas. So one, you've already heard, affordability. We need to make sure that it's affordable for girls to go to school. What's happened in COVID is that a lot of girls have found that they're just not going back into school. They're staying out. They don't have as many of the digital learning skills as many of the boys who are in their class. So the second area is distance learning. We have got to try to get every girl reached by distance learning. So this is extremely important. And when you are a refugee girl like Deborah, you need it even more. The third area is we want to mobilize communities. So there's lots of help out there, particularly women who want to help mentor girls, but we all have to help. We have lots of partners. We need to be mentors and protectors of the girls. So that leads into the fourth area, which is protection. We need to look after the girls. There is so much difficulty if you're an IDP or a refugee. It's both online and it's in person, so we need to help. And lastly, we really want young people to participate themselves, and we're seeing it in Nujeen, we're seeing it in Deborah. So these 5 points are the kind that will really help, and education is a ladder out of poverty. It's the greatest asset we can give to a young person. So thank you, Raj.
Thank you, Henrietta. And we're going to come back to you in a moment. In fact, questions are starting to pour in. We've got almost 700 people joining on this platform, hundreds more on Twitter and LinkedIn. Keep sharing those questions. If you're on Twitter, the hashtag is Stronger Together in Crisis or DevEx event. Kamal Khera, maybe I can turn to you. You're trained as a nurse. You have grown your career in the Canadian government now, as I mentioned, the permanent secretary. In development, we often have this divide between development and humanitarian issues. And education sort of fell into that gap for a long time because it was seen as a long-term issue, so therefore it's development, but of course it's affecting refugees and people who are displaced. How do you see this question of the humanitarian and development divide, and have we kind of gotten through that as a community?
Thank you, Raj. There's certainly an urgent need to address the huge challenges faced by children and youth in crisis and conflict contexts, including refugees and displaced children, as well as girls and adolescents. And yet, time and again, education gets lost in the gap between the immediate humanitarian response to crisis and the longer-term development planning that usually begins as a crisis starts to stabilize. The challenge is that the vulnerable children and youth have both the immediate and the long-term education needs. Their education needs do not stop in the midst of crisis. In fact, that's amplified. If education is lost in this gap between humanitarian and development sectors, we risk failing a generation of young people. And I think for that reason, I think these sectors must come together and unify these efforts. And we know it is possible. Education Cannot Wait has been a leader in demonstrating how education programming can be quickly and efficiently rolled out within the humanitarian development and peace nexus. The massive scale of educational disruption in the current context is pointing us to a better way of working in this nexus. And in our response to the pandemic, we must continue to combine immediate measures to support continuity of learning on one hand, with longer term planning for school reopening that will contribute to a safer, healthier, more inclusive school environments, and support for curriculum and teaching training on the other hand. So we must seize the opportunity, from this massive effort to improve our work in a protracted crisis.
Thank you, Kamal. Justin, I want to bring you into the discussion on exactly that point that Kamal has just made, which is, I can imagine one pushback is education is a long-term issue. How can we quickly address this? We know how to address shelter and food and medicine, but we can't address education quickly. You've had some experience in the Greek Isles with refugees there, and I wonder if you could help debunk the myth about how quickly we can stand up education for young people in need.
Great, thanks so much, Raj, and thanks everyone. It's great to be here. I think the Greek islands is such a perfect example of the changing nature of emergencies around the world. It's no longer these traditional emergencies as sort of this one-size-fits-all response that we've been used to. And there's a new nature of all of these challenges, and it's sort of challenging the norms and the traditional ways that we've responded. And this is a really unique example where you have refugees that were coming into the Greek islands from Turkey, but from 60 different countries around the world. And they're now within the EU borders. And this is a challenge to the humanitarian system. You have an EU government, the Greek government, which is under-resourced, very well-meaning, but has its own bureaucracies of its own to work through. You have thousands of refugees inside of the EU. They're trapped there for months in camps that were built for 2,000 people. You have 20 or 30,000 people. And the systems can't cope, and it really challenges donors in the traditional ways of working and doing things. And there was this clear humanitarian imperative, and I think that's the exciting part, because that's where ECW really brought together this idea of new forms of partnerships for rapid action. And their world really partnered with the Dutch Postcode Lottery, with ECW. We mobilized funding for UNICEF, UNHCR, local partners to deliver these rapid results, funding and filling a gap, but also building out a long-term plan. What can we be doing while we're sort of getting this immediate response out? We need to have a sustained plan. And so now we know that if we want to double capacity over the next 2 years, we need to get governments to now come on board to what's been funded by the private sector to mobilize $20 million. And we can do this. And it's not a lot of money. It can double delivery capacity. And it really is pushing the boundaries of what we've done before. It's no longer this traditional donor country provides money to a UN agency and things happen. It's different partners working together, and it's this enabling environment that ECW has created that allows people to innovate in new ways to deliver rapid results.
Time has gone so quickly, but we've got a number of great questions that have come in. I want to try to get to some of those fast if we can. Maybe Henrietta, I can ask you about one, because someone is suggesting that UNICEF, UNHCR, Education Cannot Wait, some other organizations have taken on the message that you provided, that education really is a life-saving humanitarian intervention. It provides protection. It's not just a nice-to-have long-term issue. And yet, the questioner is saying a lot of the bilateral donors, they even mentioned USAID, which you used to lead, still aren't in agreement with that idea. They still don't categorize education in emergencies as a life-saving humanitarian intervention. Where are we in changing that narrative? You have to deal with donors every day in your role as leader at UNICEF. How do you see us in that moment?
So you make a really good point, and the questioner is right on. We don't make a good case on this. So education is one of those issues where it is humanitarian and it is development. It is needed the first day of the crisis, as you can see from Nujeen, and it is needed 5 years later. So we have to think differently. It is a continuum of assistance that we are giving. The best thing we have found is give the world a great idea. And so one of the ones that we are talking about is everyone on this line, if you can join us with connecting every child and young person to learning everywhere, that will make a big difference. And we think we could do this in the next couple of years, and it will change the world, and it will make people realize that education is the foundation of all humanitarian and development response. So bring a great idea, fund it, implement it, and it will change the world.
Thank you so much, Henry. We got another question in that I want to bring to any panelist who wants to chime in, and it's about something Kelly Clements brought up in her comments about child marriage and childbearing. And this person is saying that, you know, during crises, you actually see more child marriage, you see more childbearing, and that's often one of the big gaps for getting access to school for girls in particular. How are we thinking about that in the humanitarian sector? And do you also see that as a challenge today? Anybody want to chime in on that point? Maybe Deborah, do you have any thoughts from your own experience and your time as a refugee? I mean, because so often we might have a single picture and we forget, as we've described before, that there's a lot of diversity among refugees and there is a real challenge getting girls back into school. Any thoughts on this question about child marriage and childbearing and where it fits into this issue?
Yeah, sure. If children or if refugees are not given an opportunity to have an education, meaning they spend most of their time doing other things, and those other things usually include maybe early marriages, early pregnancies. So if we can give them an opportunity to acquire education, then it will help them to be busy with something that is actually good.
Yeah, thank you for that, Deborah. Anybody else want to jump in on that? We've got many other questions coming in, and I'm happy to bring them to you. Yeah, we had another question about this gap that we've talked about so much between humanitarian and longer term development goals. You know, I understand, Kamal, you addressed it directly, that we need to bridge it. But, and really the SDGs are meant to do that. I mean, they lay out very clearly that there is no longer a divide between those two issues. And yet with this crisis, there's been a real setback. And with the COVID crisis, some people are even talking about delaying the SDG goals, or the fact that we're probably even further behind our targets than we'd want to be today. How do you see this question in a moment of real crisis? How do you talk to donors, talk to publics to re-energize them on the opportunity of the SDGs, on a united vision, as opposed to just kind of a doom and gloom message that this is so challenging we can never get there? Maybe Kamal, if you want to talk about that, and anyone else who'd like to chime in.
Certainly, Raj. Thanks for the question. You know, we can all agree that every child deserves a quality education in an environment that is safe and inclusive, even in the midst of a pandemic. You know, yet countries had to take actions to stem the spread of COVID-19, and these actions have particularly affected children's access to quality, safe education all around the world. You know, one of the things Canada is certainly concerned about, you know, with global school closures is the fact that, you know, we threaten to roll back all the gains that we have made in the recent years, particularly, you know, around gender equality in education. And Deborah gave, you know, quite an example of how that looks like, you know, whether it's in child marriages or gender-based violence, or, you know, exacerbating some of the things that you know, we have made gains on. Yet school closures also shine a light on the wider education crisis that was already underway before the pandemic. You know, as has been mentioned, you know, there are millions of children who were previously out of school before the pandemic, including at least 3.7 million refugees. We need to consider the education needs of these children, and in addition to those who have had their education disrupted by school closures. For example, you know, as we look to roll out remote learning solutions, we need to be mindful on how these solutions might continue to exclude those who did not have education access to learning before the pandemic. You know, remote learning solutions may not be accessible to them because they rely on technology, on infrastructure that is not readily available. And I think more than that, as many countries begin to plan for the reopening of schools, I think we need to remind ourselves of our commitments in the Global Compact for Refugees, particularly our commitment to the inclusion of refugees in the national educational systems. School reopening is truly an opportunity to create better, more resilient education systems that provides access for the most vulnerable, marginalized children and youth. And as such, I think our efforts should look to ensure that these children are at the heart, of our plans moving forward.
Everybody's talking about what will this pandemic mean long term, and clearly one of the things that's going to come out of it is a new appreciation for distance learning, and connectivity is going to become that much more important, as you were saying, Henrietta, that it's going to become seen as a basic need for all people to have access to the internet, because otherwise the gaps are going to be so great. And there's also real opportunities, as the minister was saying. If you can get this right, there's a real opportunity to use this moment to bring education to people who otherwise wouldn't have access. Justin, we're running out of time, but I did want to ask you, here we are in this, in a way, a positive moment on International Youth Day, talking about these great commitments. And yet there still is a pretty big gap. We heard Yasmeen talk about how the progress was to get from 2.6 to 5% of funding going to, of humanitarian funding going to education. There was recently a donor conference related to Syria. I know you and other leaders came out and criticized the fact that there really wasn't much of a commitment there for education for refugee children and displaced children. How do you see that moment? Is the world kind of failing here? Or have we gotten the message? How do you describe the situation today?
I think it goes back to some of these issues around the humanitarian development divide. How do we achieve the SDGs? Do we give up on these goals that we set? Do we postpone them? And I think we really need to not have political amnesia. And I think that's what's happening. We made these pledges, we made these commitments. We have all of the technology and resources that we need to achieve it. We have all of the partners on this call in these rooms working day in and day out, and we know what needs to be done. So there's no excuse to not achieve these education goals. We know that education is what unlocks the solution to the pandemic: economic growth, jobs for young people, better health, nutrition. We know that investing in the early years is what gets every child on the best start in life. And at the same time, we have these promises that we made at the 2016 Syria Pledging Conference. Every single Syrian child will be in school. And we were on track to achieve that. Had we moved at the rates of progress we had in 2014 and 15, that would be solved right now. But we stopped. And if we look at the projections now, it will be 2037 before we reach that goal, just for the Syria crisis. It's completely and totally unacceptable. And that's where, when International Youth Day, I think it's so important we're having this discussion, because it's young people that are holding all of us to account and that need to keep pushing this agenda, because we can't stop. We have everything we need to do it. And if we don't achieve these goals, it's because we gave up. It's because we lost the momentum, and there's no excuse for us to give up right now.
Well, I think it's a fantastic note to end this great conversation on, because you're right, there really is no excuse. Education cannot wait. And yet it still is waiting for many millions of kids. So thank you for underlining that, Justin. Thank you to all of you, Deborah, for bringing your story here, Henrietta, for laying out all those key points about how we can actually get through this. We got to know what works, as Justin just said, and Kamal for really highlighting for us how that development humanitarian divide is an illusion that we've got to get past. Thank you for a great discussion. Thank you for all the excellent questions that have come in. We've got a special address coming to you. Before we do that, though, I want to hear from everybody who's been following this discussion across all these platforms. We're going to throw up a poll question just to get a sense for how people out there have found the conversation so far. We want to ask you, what is the single most important consideration for advancing education in emergencies? And we'll give you all a moment to answer that. And I'll just say thank you again to all of our panelists and speakers for your excellent interventions. I know everyone at home is giving you a virtual applause for a really interesting discussion, and nice to see all of you. Let's see what our results are from our poll, if we can. Well, I guess the stronger together theme has come through in our discussion today, because the majority of people answering this feel it's about stronger collective efforts and partnerships. And I think that's a great segue to our final special address from Jan Egeland, a name you all know well. He was, of course, the UN's humanitarian chief. He has played many roles over the years and has served in so many humanitarian crises, and is now the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. He is someone I often turn to get a take on the situation broadly. And so now maybe, Jan, after hearing all of the interventions in today's conversation, you can help to wrap this up for us and really frame the moment that we're in when it comes to education in emergencies and in protracted crises. Thank you, Jan. Please, welcome.
Thank you, Raj. Thanks to everybody for a great session. 3 messages in 3 minutes. The first is there has been historic progress in education in emergencies. There's been a big investment. I now feel we need to not only defend that, we need to develop this. I've been a humanitarian worker for 40 years. When I started, there wasn't education. There was a little bit of education for boys, no education for girls. When I traveled now in all of the war zones and crisis areas, there is emergency education thanks to courageous teachers, and there has been progress. My own organization, NRC, found out in 2014 we had 250,000 children, displaced children in education. It was too low. We ramped up with Education Cannot Wait, with UNICEF, with Norway, with EU, Sweden, and others. And we now had 1.1 million displaced children, 51% girls, 49% boys last year. There has been progress. We need to build on that. Second, the progress for boys and girls in primary and secondary education has not seen a commensurate effort for youth. We have the youth groups between 15 and 24 are massively out of school, out of education, out of livelihoods creation, out of hope. To me, the number one priority now is to get youth into the same kind of momentum that we have had for boys and girls of the younger ages. And it is International Youth Day today. Third and final, the pandemic is actually a massive setback for all of us. We are now seeing that millions and millions of boys and girls, youth, are out of school. Millions. The crisis is profound. Therefore, the investment in alternative education, remote education, new technology has to be much bigger. There is regression now. We need to defend the progress that we have had the last 10 years. So Lebanon, as a positive example now, I mean, Lebanon in its midst of its deepest economic, political crisis, 1.7 million refugees, an explosion devastating the capital, there is ongoing efforts to keep Palestinian and Syrian refugee children and local host community children in school. A 20% subsidy for internet to children and youth has meant to massive learning in the evenings when the youth come, the children can go away from their daily survival struggle. There is a possibility to keep up the momentum even in the midst of this horrific pandemic. The message from the children and the youth is we need education as much as we need food. It is a question of survival. I agree on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. You really wrapped it up beautifully for us. And Lebanon's a good example. I mean, we've all watched those horrific pictures of the explosion there. And maybe it underlines a reality that we're all coming to terms with, that crisis is the new normal. And that has been the case for so many people in the world. You think about the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, they fled one crisis, then the COVID pandemic hit. Now there's an explosion. And we as a global community, maybe it's a very thin silver lining, but the fact that we're all going through a global pandemic together, hopefully can highlight for all of us that we need to use this moment. We need to use this as an opportunity to rethink the way we address challenges like education and crises. And I hope our session today, coming on International Youth Day, helps all of us to do that. I know that the hundreds and well over 1,000 people who've joined this session, and those of you who will watch this as time goes on, I know you're committed to these issues, but I hope this gives you a moment to redouble that commitment, to get re-energized, to better understand the opportunity here. If we can get things right, if we can come together as a community, that we really can be stronger. And I want to applaud Education Cannot Wait and recommend to you this annual report they've just issued as something worth reading to see the scale of the problem, but also the promise that if we come together, there is much we can do. So my thanks to all of these incredible speakers. I wish we had more time with all of you. My real thanks to all of you joining us from all over the world for your questions and your participation. These are issues we at DevEx feel very strongly about and will continue to cover through our journalism in the coming days and the coming months. And we appreciate you following us on social media and really interacting with our whole community. So my thanks to Education Cannot Wait. My thanks to all of you. Have a wonderful day.